everyone. Thanks so much for joining our live webinar this morning. We're going to get started here in just a few moments. I'm going to let everyone log in and get settled, and then we'll get started with the presentation, Building Great Scrum Masters. Today's webinar covers one of the top 10 most promising jobs of 2017, the Scrum Master. We'll be taking an in-depth look at what this role actually covers, where to find the best talent, and how a truly skilled Scrum Master can vastly improve the productivity of your entire team. My name is Lindsay Locke. I'm Pluralsight's Webinar Program Manager. I'll be your host today, and I'm here if you have any questions about the webinar recording, future webinar topics, or anything related to the presentation interface. I'm very happy to introduce today's presenter, Pluralsight author and Agile coach, Jeremy Jarrell. Jeremy, I'll let you introduce yourself a little bit further on. Just a little bit of background about Jeremy. He's a previous host of our webinar series. He's a highly rated speaker, and he's also an excellent contributor to our blog. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you, Lindsay.
So just a couple of quick things for our audience that you can expect during the presentation. Before we get started, we are going to accept your questions today during the presentation. There is a chat box on your screen. That's where you can submit your Q&A. We'll get to those at the end of the presentation. In addition to that, we are recording, so don't forget to submit your questions. And then if you have to leave early, we will record everything and share the recording with everyone later. Let's do a quick audio check. We don't have a dial-in, but the sound for today's presentation should be coming from your computer speakers. If you experience any lag in the slides, or if you have any audio issues, please try refreshing your browser. If you need to, you can log out and jump back in, or send me a chat and I'll try to help you out. In addition to that, there's a couple other things you'll notice in the interface. You can expand the presentation window if you'd like to see your screen larger. There are some really helpful downloads and links to the left of the screen. You can learn more about our presenter. You can tweet at us. Also, before you leave today, there's a super short survey that's going to pop up. It's 3 questions. We'd really love to get your feedback. So if you could take that, we'd appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand everything over to Jeremy and let him get started. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you for the very, very kind introduction. And I also want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today. I really appreciate everyone taking time out of their busy day to hear what we have to say today. So thank you so much. So as Lindsay said, my name is Jeremy Jarrell. I'm an Agile coach who often works with Scrum teams who are just kind of getting started on their Scrum journey. I'm an author of Pluralsight, where I focus mainly on courses that have to do with the Scrum framework. And when I'm not authoring or coaching, I'm also a mentor. In my mentoring role, I also work with Pluralsight as a mentor to Scrum Masters, and sometimes these are Scrum Masters who have just found themselves in the role, and they're looking for a little bit guidance on how to get started and how to get their Scrum legs under them, so to speak. Or sometimes these are more intermediate to advanced level Scrum Masters who have the basics of the framework and their role down and their role within it, and are looking for a little guidance on kind of how to further their craft as a Scrum Master. So what I want to talk about today is how we can build great Scrum Masters. So what goes into a great Scrum Master? And to do this, we'll talk about a few things. First, I want to talk about how Scrum Masters work with your team to make them more effective. What is it that these people do that can really help your team become more effective at delivering value to your organization? And we're going to talk about how do you find the right Scrum Master for your team? What is it that makes someone that seems to be pretty attuned to this role, or seems to make someone a natural fit for this role? And what kind of qualities and aptitudes should you be looking for inside your organization to find the individuals that will be the best fit for this role? And how do you staff the Scrum Master role? So one of the biggest questions that we're often asked whenever we talking to organizations that are adopting Scrum and start talking about the Scrum Master role is, what is this role? Is this a part-time role? Is this a full-time role? How many teams are Scrum Masters working with? And there really is no easy answer for this. So we're going to talk a little bit about what kind of things you should be thinking about when you decide what staffing strategy makes the most sense for your organization. And finally, I want to shift gears a little bit at the end and talk to those of you in the audience who are here because you're looking at the Scrum Master role and something about it really appeals to you. It really catches your eye, and you think this might be a good step for you be the next step in your career. So I want to talk a little bit about what you can do to maybe get started on your path to becoming a Scrum Master. So, but why are we here today? Why are we talking about the Scrum Master? And the reason is that Scrum Master demand is just at an all-time high. So I'm lucky enough that I get to work with Scrum Masters almost on a weekly basis, if not a daily basis sometimes. And I've never seen such a surge in demand for Scrum Masters as I have in the past 2 to 3 years. So I just want to talk about this a little bit just to give you some idea where this comes from. So we're all familiar with LinkedIn. LinkedIn obviously has access to a lot of the job trends, both from the job postings that are advertising on LinkedIn, people that are updating their roles on LinkedIn, new user profiles that are popping up in different roles. And one of the cool things that they do with that is every year they kind of step back and they look at, like, let's look at all the data, let's comb all the data, and let's see what jobs really seem the most promising, both in demand and in possibility for growth. And then every January or so, they put out a survey, or excuse me, they put out a report of here are what we see the most promising jobs for the next year. And there's often 20 to 30 jobs on here. So in January of 2017, they put out their list of their most promising jobs for 2017. And much to a lot of people's surprise, the Scrum Master role was number 10. It made the top 10 most promising job of 2017, according to LinkedIn's data. And there are a lot of reasons for this. One of them, one of the most staggering reasons, was that just in January 2017, LinkedIn had seen 104% growth in demand for Scrum Masters over the previous year. So think about that. Just in 12 months, the number of job requisitions, the number of job postings specifically asking for someone to fill the Scrum Master role more than doubled. And that was in January 2017. Now, I'm here in Pittsburgh. I'm based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in the United States. So I work mainly in our local market. But looking at just what I've seen empirically in our local market, I think we're probably on track to double that again by the end of 2017. So just the surge in growth for this role, the surge in demand, has been staggering. But of course, that hasn't come cheap. Anytime we see a surge in demand for a role, especially one that's hard to fill, it comes at a cost. So this role that's growing so rapidly often has a median base salary of $100,000 US, at least here in the United States. Now, this is just base salary before we get into any other compensation like fringe or bonus potential, profit sharing, anything else that we stack on top of that. Just the base salary for a Scrum Master here in the U.S. is $100,000. And once again, from what I see when I work with Scrum Masters on a weekly basis or so, that number might even be a little bit low today compared to what it was a year ago. So there's definitely a lot of demand in this role. But what is this role and why is it in so much demand right now? So let's talk a little bit about what great Scrum Masters do day to day and how that really helps your team. So before we get into this, I do want to step back and talk a little bit first about the Scrum framework and the role of the Scrum framework, because that will put a lot of context on why this role is so valuable. So don't worry, I'm not going to dive too deep into the mechanics of the Scrum framework. I know that probably wasn't why a lot of people joined today, so we're not going to go too deep here. But I do want to take a few moments and talk about what the roles of the Scrum framework are. So the Scrum framework prescribes 3 roles for your team to fill if they're going to adopt the Scrum framework. The first of these roles is the product owner. Now, the product owner is who chooses and defines the work that they think would be the most valuable for the team to work on in the next sprint. What's the work that would be the most valuable for the rest of the Scrum team to be producing? So we often say that the product owner is accountable for optimizing the value that the organization is getting from their Scrum team. Whenever an organization fields a Scrum team, obviously that's a pretty significant investment of resources and capital. The product owner is accountable for making sure that the organization is seeing a positive return on value from that investment. But if the product owner chooses the work that the team should be working on, the development team is who actually delivers that work. So the development team is who is responsible for actually producing the work that's selected and chosen by the product owner to be delivered at the end of the sprint. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about nomenclature here. So when we're speaking Scrum, whenever we're talking in the context of the Scrum framework, when we talk about developers, a developer can be an engineer who writes code on the product. But a developer may also be a tester who validates that code and validates that it's doing what we expect it to do. A developer could even be a designer who's responsible for creating a compelling UI and a great user experience that really draws the user in and really retains them inside the product. Whenever we're speaking Scrum, a developer is anyone who has a hand in the delivery of the product increment. So whether you're creating designs, whether you're testing, whether you're writing code, whether you're a DBA, whatever you're doing, if you have a hand in the delivery of that product increment at the end of the sprint, we consider you a developer. So the development team is this cross-functional team that could be made up of testers, designers, DBAs, coders, anything you can think of, who all work together to deliver this product. So when I talk about developers today, just remember that I'm not necessarily talking only about coders or engineers. I could be talking about testers, designers, anyone who works with the rest of the team to deliver value to the organization. But then what does the Scrum Master do? Well, the Scrum Master is who ties the entire team together. So we look at the Scrum Master to ensure that the team as a whole is being effective and really that the team is working as a truly cohesive unit, not just a group of individuals that happen to be in the same room and showing up at the same time every day. The Scrum Master really works with the team as a whole to make sure that they're working together as effectively as they can. But how do they do this? Well, there are a lot of ways. Let's talk about a few of them. First and foremost, what you're probably most familiar with is the Scrum Master teaches the team the Scrum framework. So the Scrum Master is responsible for ensuring the team understands the Scrum framework and how they can be the most effective in it. But this is more than just simply understanding the mechanics of the Scrum framework, of teaching the team the time boxes of the events and the formats and just making sure the team is following the rules of Scrum. That's definitely part of it, but great Scrum Masters work to understand the deeper value that each component of the Scrum framework is really trying to achieve, and then they work with their team to make sure that they're actually realizing the value and they're doing it in the way that's most effective for that team. Sure, we want them to follow the rules, to follow the mechanics of the Scrum framework because that makes it easier, and those are there for a reason, but that's not the goal. We want the Scrum Master to understand what the value that each piece of the Scrum framework is bringing, and then communicate that to a team in a way that they can realize that value the most effectively. The Scrum Master also keeps a team on track. Now, often we think about this in the context of, oh, the Scrum Master removes blockers. The Scrum Master removes impediments. If during the daily Scrum someone says, oh, I almost have this story delivered, but when I went to ship it to production yesterday, I found out my credentials for the production account were expired or my password's expired. I don't know who to talk to. The Scrum Master puts on his impediment remover cape and swoops into action and gets the team cleared. That's definitely part of it. They remove blockers, but they also keep the team focused. They watch to make sure that what the team is spending their time on is stuff that was actually identified as part of the sprint, stuff that contributes to the sprint goal, and it may also works with the product owner to make sure that, hey, here are the items we're putting into the sprint planning. Does this really match the product vision that you laid out and what you wanted to really achieve with this? And the Scrum Master is a coach. Now, this may surprise some of you, but we really look at the Scrum Master as a coaching role. Even if you're not an Agile coach, even if you're not a Scrum coach, there absolutely is a coaching stance to the Scrum Master. And this takes a lot of forms. Maybe the Scrum Master works with the development team to help them identify ways that they can improve, they can be more effective. What are the opportunities for improvement that the team has in front of them, and what are some different ways that we can try to implement some of those improvements? So what are the ways we can put together an action plan that maybe we can get better at how we work together. But the Scrum Master doesn't just work with the development team, they also coach the product owner. The Scrum Master may work with the product owner on things like, here's how you can more effectively communicate the vision that you have to the team. Here's how you can be more available, be more approachable to the team to better serve the team, because the more approachable that you are, the more likely what that development team delivers is going to match what you had in mind. So the Scrum Master really coaches at different levels throughout the team just to help the whole team work together and be more effective. And finally, great Scrum Masters act as a change agent within their organization. So often when an organization adopts Scrum, sometimes an organization goes all in, they turn the table, so to speak, and everyone kind of hops on board the Scrum framework at once. But more often what we're seeing today is that often organizations start their Scrum adoption piece by piece. For example, they may start with something as simple as a single pilot team who is going to try the Scrum framework for the lifetime of a product, and at the end we'll come back and we'll see how it does. We'll see how it compared to everything else the organization was doing. In cases like this, the Scrum Master needs to work as a change agent inside the organization to help others who are outside of the team understand, hey, this team's going to be working a little differently than you may be expecting, and here's why we're doing things differently. Here's how we hope to get out of it, but here's what you can expect, and here's some things that you can do to better enable this team. Here's how you can set this team up for success. So the Scrum Master really works inside the organization to help that. But what great Scrum Masters really understand is that everything they're doing to serve the team, to understand the mechanics of the framework, is not just simply in the pursuit of perfect Scrum. Great Scrum Masters understand that perfect Scrum is not the goal. Delivering value to your organization is the goal. Delivering a great product that really draws your users in and creates traction with your users and is a profitable model for your customers, for your company as a whole, that's the goal. Scrum just enables that. Scrum just makes that possible. Great Scrum Masters understand that for this reason, Scrum is the means, but it's not the end. It's not what they're ultimately after. But now we understand where the best Scrum Masters, or what the best Scrum Masters are doing to help your team. Let's talk a little bit about where the best candidates for Scrum Master come from. So look at it a couple places. One place is obviously we want to start internally. Are there people internal to your organization that you think might be a great fit for the Scrum Master, that have expressed a lot of interest in becoming a Scrum Master? If you can start there, that's a great place to start, because internal candidates, recruiting from within, has a lot of advantages. So one is internal candidates have a natural understanding of your organizational culture and how to swim in the political waters. They understand what the organizational dynamics are that they're going to have to be aware of. They understand how they can kind of move throughout the organization most effectively, and where they're most likely to get support when their team gets in trouble. This can be incredibly valuable, especially to a team that's new to Scrum and may need a little help getting started along the way. But internal candidates also have existing relationships from which they can build. We just talked a lot about why coaching is such an important aspect of the Scrum Master role and why it's something that's so important to a successful Scrum Master. Well, no coaching can occur without first having a relationship to which to build on. For you to be effective in your role as a coach, you have to first invest in relationship. You have to build a foundation of trust. You have to build understanding and empathy for the individuals that you're coaching. All that has to happen before any effective coaching can occur. So that all takes a lot of relationship building and investing in relationship. A Scrum Master that's been inside of your organization for several years, obviously knows a lot of people inside, hopefully at least has some pretty strong and well-developed relationships on the team, and maybe they even have some outside of their team on the organization as well. That can give them a huge leg up when those coaching opportunities start to appear. But it's not all rosy. Internal candidates might have blind spots. And what I mean about this is an internal candidate may not be able to see these more subtle impediments, or they may have grown so used to these subtle impediments that exist in their organization that they just don't even spot them anymore. They've evolved ways to work around them, to turn a blind eye to these what we call the elephant in the room impediments. These challenges the team might be facing of, oh, I can't get clarification on this story because the product owner only shows up at our sprint planning and then he just that he just talks to us by email for the rest of the sprint, or the product owner only really shows up at the sprint review and he doesn't really guide the stakeholders, so the stakeholders never give us any meaningful feedback until it's too late. These are often very tough impediments that often are a smell of a deeper organizational dysfunction that have to be addressed. When you live inside of organizations that have these impediments for long enough, you start to become blind to them. You start to turn away from them, and you're less apt to face them head on because you've learned ways to work around them. A Scrum Master who's coming from internal, who has experience in your organization, may be a little bit aware of that. You have to be wary that they're not going to look at these impediments and just turn a blind eye because they're under the idea or under the impression they just can't be corrected. But if you can't find someone internally, then where do you go? Well, then we start looking externally. We start looking at candidates from outside of our organization. This, just as the internal option, has a lot of advantages as well. One of the biggest is that external candidates will bring new perspectives to your team. They have different perspectives they can draw on. And the reason for this is that if you are hiring a Scrum Master from outside of your organization, odds are that person has decent experience as a Scrum Master. They've worked with 2 or 3 teams before in the Scrum Master role, so they have a lot of perspectives that they can bring to your team's adoption that can be very valuable. You might start to hear things like, oh, I've seen this before. Here's this problem I'm starting to spot on this team. I've seen this on another team I worked with. Here's how we addressed it. Here's how we tried. Now, great Scrum Masters know that what worked with one team may not work with other teams. Not every solution is going to apply to every single team, and they realize that, but they at least have a toolbox. They have a set of options that they can at least start with, and these new perspectives can really come in handy whenever the team starts to get into trouble. And along these lines, they also have a deep depth of experience they can draw from as well, which is incredibly helpful when your organization is new to Scrum, when they're new to Agile. Great Scrum Masters who have this depth of experience can start to spot the pitfalls that lay in wait down the path that the team is progressing on and can call them out before the team gets there and trips over them. You might hear things like, hey, here's this behavior I'm seeing emerging on this team. Just so you know, I've seen this before, and here's how it tends to end. Or here's this option, you guys are trying this to try to work around this impediment. That can work in the short term, but here's what it often tends to set up down the road that we're eventually going to have to face. So they can start to draw on this depth of experience to start to bring your attention to things that if you don't have that same level of experience, you may not be as apt to spot before your team gets into trouble. The other advantage is that Scrum Masters who are external won't have these pre-existing assumptions or these biases that we talked about for the internal candidates. These Scrum Masters are going to come into your organization with a fresh perspective. They're going to be more apt to address these challenges head on. They're going to be more attuned to spotting these things that just don't feel right, that the rest of the organization has simply gone a little blind to. We've all hired people for our team who come in on day one and are ready to change the world. That's the energy that you're looking for in a Scrum Master who's going to come in. Now, obviously, we don't want the Scrum Master to come in on day one and blow the world up. Great Scrum Masters know they need to pick their battles, that there are certain times for everything. There are certain times when they need to address everything, and they're going to choose the right time to do so. But they at least come in with an awareness and a willingness to address these impediments when the time is right. But I think it probably goes without saying, but the biggest disadvantage that external Scrum Masters will have is that they're going to have to work a little harder. They're not going to have these advantages coming in that internal candidates will. They're going to have to work a little harder to learn how to swim in the organization's political waters. They're going to have to learn the organizational landscape and who they can go to for help whenever their team starts to get into trouble. And great Scrum Masters understand that this organizational landscape, this map they're building in their minds of who they can lean on for support whenever their team needs help, may not necessarily be the same as the organization's org chart. An organization's org chart rarely represents exactly how work gets done in an organization. It often doesn't represent or doesn't accurately represent how decisions get made in an organization. There's almost a shadow org chart that you have to learn to understand who you can really go to that's most likely to give you the support, to give you the help you need to move your team forward. And great Scrum Masters understand they're going to have to learn this. They're also going to have to work to invest in building relationships, both within their team and the broader organization. Now, as we said, relationships are necessary. They're a necessary starting point for a Scrum Master to be able to coach effectively throughout their team, but those relationships take time to build. So on day one, they're going to have to start investing in those relationships and build this relationship and these foundations of trust and empathy before they can even start to think about how they can coach the team to be more effective. So now we understand a little bit about where we can find individuals for this role and how we can start to recruit from this role. Let's talk about how do we staff it? How do we get the most from this? So one of the most common questions we hear whenever an organization is starting with Scrum and is starting to think about the Scrum Master role first is this a full-time role? So is this a part-time role? How many teams can a Scrum Master work with? There's a lot of things that come into this. And if you read the Scrum Guide, which is kind of our overarching guide, or overarching canon of Scrum, and what it talks about for the Scrum Master, what you'll find is that it says nothing. It doesn't address staffing or allocation concerns at all. And what that means is that the answer is going to differ depending on every organization. Every organization, every team is going to have a different answer to this. So what I want to do is talk to you about, instead of giving you a simple answer that may or may not apply in your organization, I want to talk about some of the models that you're most likely to see when we start thinking about Scrum Master staffing and the pros and cons of each, so you'll be better informed to make the decision that's right for your team. The first that you're likely to see is what we call the half Scrum Master, half developer role. So what we see here, like our Scrum Master guy up here in the top, he's half green, half blue. When he's green, he's wearing his Scrum Master hat. So he's working with the team, he's coaching the team, he's facilitating the Scrum framework. But when he's blue, he's a developer, just like his colleagues here on the team. Now, this is one of the most common models you'll see, and there's a good reason for this. It has a ton of advantages. One of the biggest is that the Scrum Master becomes very tightly integrated with the team. The Scrum Master's in the trenches with the team day in and day out, and he really feels their pain. He starts to understand the friction that the team is facing that maybe the team has become numb to and isn't even aware of, that when it comes time for him to put his Scrum Master hat back on, he can start to bring this friction to the surface and talk to the team about how they can address it. He also has a deep understanding of just how the team works, what's the team's flow for software development, and where are the opportunities for improvement there that may be lying in wait that the team hasn't spotted yet. And he's respected by the team because he's there beside them as an individual contributor. Now, remember, a developer in the eyes of Scrum could be an engineer, could be a tester, could be a designer. To be respected by the team and be inside the trenches, he doesn't have to be writing code. He could be designing tests and testing software. He could be creating UI designs. But whatever it is, he's there in the trenches beside the team, and he's contributing alongside the team to the product. So that earns a lot of respect. This can be incredibly valuable in organizations who are just venturing into Scrum for the first time, and there might be a little bit of wariness. There might be a little bit of doubt across the team of, like, what is this Scrum framework, and who is this Scrum Master guy that seems to just be the Scrum police that slaps us on the wrist if we go over 15 minutes in our daily Scrum. So this can buy the Scrum Master a little bit of leeway to start to make some of these tougher changes, or start to enable some of these changes to make the team more effective if they're already respected by the team in other capacities. The last thing I want to say about this model is that it can be an incredibly time-consuming model. And it's not particularly the model itself, but the Scrum Master role. So that's the biggest thing that we need to keep in mind when we look at this model for our team, for our organization. And the reason is that there's a lot that comes with the Scrum Master role. Now, is it always a full-time role? Maybe not necessarily. It depends a lot on the maturity of the team and how much the team really needs the Scrum Master, but especially early in their adoption of the Scrum framework, the team can be very, very dependent on the Scrum Master. And so that can create a lot of time that the Scrum Master needs to work on. The Scrum Master tends to spend a lot of time in event preparation, things like activities like backlog refinement with the product owner, just different things that are very demanding of the Scrum Master's time. The other challenge with this is that the demands on the Scrum Master's time can be very very unpredictable because they're often driven by need of the team. Remember we talked about the Scrum Master needs to keep the team on track, and that often takes the form of removing impediments, removing blockers from the team's path. That can be very unpredictable and be tough to plan for. It's not uncommon at all for a Scrum Master to come in 2 to 3 days in the sprint and might have the mindset of, oh, I only have to do the daily Scrum today with our team, and then I just put my headphones on and I can write code all day. I can test all day and really make some great progress. And then something happens. Something blows up in the daily Scrum, and the Scrum Master might have to spend a day, the next day, just trying to get things corrected, trying to get the impediments removed so the team can get on track. So there's a lot that comes with this. I often recommend Scrum Masters who are considering this role, or organizations who are considering this half Scrum Master, half developer role, that can really communicate to their Scrum Master that it's probably better suited that they avoid picking up these very complex stories, these very complex features, at least early on, that if they get stuck, if they get pulled off and have to address something else for a day, 2 days, 3 days, leaving that story open doesn't block the rest of the team, or look for ways that the rest of the team can kind of swarm in and help. It's often better to look more for opportunities to address kind of shallow defects, shallow enhancements that are spread across the code base. This has a couple of advantages. One is that if the Scrum Master has to drop what they're doing and go worry about a Scrum Master duty for a day or so, a shallow defect isn't likely to block the progress of the rest of the team. Also, working shallowly across the entire code base gives the Scrum Master a much broader breadth of perspective of what the team is dealing with, and helps them better understand the challenges the team is facing than if they're focused incredibly tightly on a very deep but very narrow niche inside the code base, and they're only really looking at that. That also has a disadvantage that if the Scrum Master does get pulled off, and they've become the only silo of knowledge about that section of the code on the team, there aren't a lot of people that can kind of come in and help pick up the work. So it's important that you kind of plan around that when you're thinking about if your Scrum Master is also going to be an individual contributor on the team, what can they do that will have the least impact for the team if they have to go away and worry about the Scrum Master duties for a little bit. You also need to communicate that to an individual who's considering the Scrum Master role, so that they understand that if this is someone who really loves to write code, this is someone who really loves to do design and create compelling designs, this isn't, as part of taking on this role, they're going to have a lot less time to do this. They're going to find themselves writing code a lot less. They're going to find themselves testing a lot less, just simply because of the obligations of the Scrum Master role. So that needs to be communicated to them, and they're prepared for, so they understand how to handle that. The next model I want to talk about is one Scrum Master dedicated to teams. So in this case, we have our green Scrum Master on the left. He's the Scrum Master for the blue team. And our other Scrum Master on the right, she's the Scrum Master for the red team. So once again, this has some great models, or it has some great advantages. In this case, they're very, very dedicated to the team because they're with the team full time. And a common thread you're probably hearing now is, once again, for a team who's new to Scrum, this can be very, very advantageous. Teams that are new to the Scrum framework often need a little more help from their Scrum Master, need a little more guidance from the Scrum Master, or honestly, even a team who may be very experienced in the Scrum framework, but it's a team's first foray into a brand new product, or it's a team of individuals who have never worked with each other before. They're going to have to take time to understand how they can work the most effectively together, how they can gel together. That's going to demand a little bit more of the Scrum Master's time. So having someone who's fully dedicated to the team is very, very valuable, because it can do a lot to move the team, because they're very, very devoted to the role. They're always going to be there. They're always going to be available to the team, that as impediments crop up, as challenges crop up, they're available immediately to start to work with the team to resolve those. But it has disadvantages. Obviously, the biggest one is it can be extremely expensive. So we just talked a little bit earlier today about how expensive the Scrum Master role is and what the base salary looks like for this role and how expensive it can be. Scrum Master roles are also interesting that they're a little tough to quantify the value back to the organization. There's no question they add value, but they add value in the form of enabling your team. So you often see that value come out a little indirectly compared to someone who might be an individual contributor leader who might be a great designer or a great tester or a great coder. So you have to understand when you're incurring this cost, and not only are you incurring this cost of a very expensive role that can be a little tough to quantify sometimes to others in your organization, you're now incurring this cost on every single team throughout your organization. And that adds up quickly. The other disadvantage is it creates idle hands. Scrum Masters who are completely dedicated to a team may not always be busy. And this is challenging because this gets into the question of, is it a full-time role? And sometimes it absolutely can be, but sometimes it's not. Or sometimes it is one week and the next week it's not. It just really ebbs and flows according to the needs of the team. A Scrum Master who may not have enough to keep themselves busy throughout the week isn't likely to sit on their hands. Great Scrum Masters tend to be self-starters. They tend to be a little ambitious, so they're not likely to sit on their hands and wait for work to come to them. They'll create work for themselves. This can be advantageous because there are things they can do that can be beneficial to the team, but a lot of this stuff can also take the form of low-value work that doesn't really add anything to the team and not only creates an ongoing obligation for the Scrum Master, but even ongoing obligations for the team that they now have to contend with. One of the most common ways you see this come out is with metrics. If I walk into a team and there are metrics everywhere, there are burn down charts all over the wall, and hit rate charts, and work in progress charts, and CFD charts all over the wall, and every aspect of how the team works together and how the team delivers software has been mapped and tracked for the last couple months. Sometimes it's a smell that maybe that Scrum Master has a little too much time on their hands. So we have to watch for those things, and we have to make sure that the Scrum Master is not using this time to create unnecessary work that at the best just doesn't really add a ton of value to their team, or at the worst is simply creating an ongoing obligation for their team, ongoing work for their team. The last big disadvantage here of this model is that it increases the Scrum Master's dependency, or increases the team's dependency on the Scrum Master. So let's talk about this a little bit, because this may be a bit surprising. Great Scrum Masters understand that their overarching goal is not to be the end-all servant for their team and to be there at the team's every beck and call and anticipate their team's every need. There is a time where that can be beneficial, but over the long term, that's not what we want. Great Scrum Masters want to teach their team to fish. They want to teach their team to start to recognize the impediments that are in their path and understand how they can remove them. They want to teach their team to recognize these opportunities for improvement that exist in front of them and put together an action plan or implement a plan in coming sprints that they can start to realize some of those improvements. A team that becomes incredibly dependent on their Scrum Master to handle every single aspect of this may do really great in the short term, but eventually that Scrum Master is going to get sick. Eventually that Scrum Master is going to take a vacation. Eventually that Scrum Master is going to become very burnt out and is going to leave the organization for another opportunity. And when that happens, that team is going to find themselves in a lot of trouble. So great Scrum Masters need to kind of coach their team down the path that they can be more self-sufficient. They can handle a lot of these responsibilities themselves so they're less dependent on the Scrum Master. This is tough to do when the Scrum Master is by the team's side every moment of every day. And the last model I want to talk about is the model where one Scrum Master is shared across teams. So in this case, our green Scrum Master is serving the Scrum Master role for both the blue team and the red team. And this is a very, very common model. You're seeing this more and more every day. And one of the reasons is that it can be more cost effective. You're still incurring the cost of a full-time Scrum Master, but you're now amortizing that cost across multiple teams in your organization, which makes it a little more palatable. It also exposes the Scrum Master to more situations because they're working with more teams. This is a great way to supercharge a Scrum Master's experience because they're now getting the experience of working with multiple teams almost in parallel. And this has a lot of advantages because they can start to recognize situations that are starting to emerge on one team that they've already dealt with on another team. Or when one team gets into trouble, they can bring opportunities to the table or bring ideas to the table and say, oh, you know what, we actually just saw something really similar on the blue team. Let's talk about what worked for them and what they tried. And once again, maybe that solution will work for the red team, maybe it won't, but at least gives them somewhere to start. And finally, it reduces the team's dependency on the Scrum Master because the Scrum Master is not there. The Scrum Master was not there all the time. Maybe the Scrum Master has a sprint planning session that they need to work with another team to facilitate at the same time as another team's daily Scrum. So the team has to be more self-sufficient to conduct their daily Scrum and facilitate it in an effective way. Maybe something happens on the blue team and the Scrum Master has an emergency to deal with it. They're all focused on that team for the next 2 days at the same time that the red team has their sprint review and their sprint retrospective. They're forced to become more self-sufficient to facilitate these events. In this model, the Scrum Master is there. If something truly happens that demands the Scrum Master's attention, he's a tap on the shoulder away. He can be there to help the team, but he's not immediately as available as he was in the other model. So it starts to grow a little self-sufficiency on the team. But there are disadvantages. The biggest is that the Scrum Master is just no longer in the trenches with the team. So they become more dependent on what the team says, not what the Scrum Master is really seeing for themselves. This really takes the form when we start talking about blockers and impediments and what is in the team's path that the Scrum Master needs to remove. When the Scrum Master is not in the trenches every day beside the team, then they have to become more dependent on what the team says is a problem, what the team says is blocking them, and have to almost take for granted that, okay, what the team is not describing, or what there are things here that there may be other things lurking here that the team isn't mentioning, but I'm going to trust them that they're not there because I'm not there to see it every day. And the Scrum Master also starts to feel a little bit less like a team member and more of an outside member. And this takes two forms. From the perspective of the team, this can be challenging. This can start to erode some of the trust, some of the empathy and the relationship building that the Scrum Master has invested in with their team. Now, this doesn't mean that maybe the rest of the team starts to dislike the Scrum Master. They may still think the Scrum Master is a great guy. They may love the Scrum Master. But simply because he's not there as much as he used to be, that erodes a little bit of trust and a little bit of the relationship that they have to work from. And it also can affect the Scrum Master. If the Scrum Master isn't around as much every day, it can be very easy for them to start to slip into almost a TaskRabbit persona where they're less interested in working with the team over the long term and helping them improve for the long term, and they become more focused on keeping the team on track and pushing the team forward and more focused on what the team is producing sprint by sprint instead of really thinking about how the team can work more sustainably for the long term. So those are the three most common models you're likely to encounter when you start thinking about how to staff the Scrum Master role. And like I said, there really is no simple answer of which model is going to be best for you. It depends on the needs of your organization. So you want to look at the needs of your organization, look at your team structures and the needs of your team, where you are kind of in your adoption cycle of the Scrum framework, and figure out which ones seem to make the most sense to you. The other thing I would ask you to remember is that these models aren't static. So what may be the best choice for you today may not be the best choice for you 6 months from now, or that may not be the best choice for you a year from now. So understand that your needs and your team's needs are going to evolve, and they're going to change with your organization, and along with that, the model that best fits you may be evolving as well. It's very common for a team who's very new to Scrum or an organization who's very new to Scrum to start with a model where there's a full-time Scrum Master assigned to every single team because each Scrum Master is there to help the team. They're embedded with the team. But as the organization matures in their Scrum adoption, as they become more self-sufficient, it makes more sense for an organization to start to look at a model where maybe that Scrum Master is a part-time developer, part-time Scrum Master, or maybe you start to share one Scrum Master across a few teams because the teams aren't as dependent on the Scrum Masters as they were in the past. So understand which model is right for you and also which model is right for you today. So before we wrap up, I want to shift gears a little bit. And I want to talk to those of you in the audience who are here because you're interested in the Scrum Master role. It's maybe the next step in your career. Maybe what I'm saying has appealed to you, or maybe you've looked at the role before and you're pretty interested in it. It seems like something that fits you naturally, but you want to learn a little more. Let's talk a little bit about how you can get started in your journey towards the Scrum Master. So the first thing we want to start at is just look at how can you help your team. So becoming a Scrum Master is much more about helping your team and aiding your team than it is understanding the ins and outs of the Scrum framework. So the good news is that gives you a great place to start. Simply look for opportunities on your team that you can start to help them with. Look for opportunities for improvement, and either try to address those opportunities yourself, or bring those opportunities to your team's awareness and try to guide the team toward changing those opportunities themselves or taking advantage of those opportunities for themselves, and start investing in those relationships. Remember, relationship building is a critical aspect to becoming a successful Scrum Master, because that's what enables effective coaching. So there's no better time than to start investing in the relationships both inside and outside of your team than today. And then we can start talking about Scrum. So a great place to go from here is to read the Scrum Guide. Now, there are resources that Lindsay's made available for everyone today, and one of those resources is the Scrum Guide. The good news is that it's available for free online, and the better news is it's short. The Scrum Guide, which talks about every aspect of the Scrum framework, goes through every role, every artifact, every event, every value that underlies Scrum, and how everything ties together, is 17 pages long. It's a very, very quick read. You can sit down with your favorite drink this evening and read it in the afternoon. It's a very, very easy read. Now, to be clear, there is a lot implied between the lines of those 17 pages. And often when I work as a mentor for Scrum Masters, one of the first things we talk about is let's start reading the Scrum Guide every year, because every reread you're going to understand things, you're going to pick things up that are now implied by your own experiences as a Scrum Master that you wouldn't have spotted 6 months ago or a year ago. But just to get started, you can read the entire guide in an evening and understand at least identify all the mechanics and all the aspects of the Scrum framework. And then another great place to go is Pluralsight. So I would be remiss if I did not mention that Pluralsight actually has a great learning path on the Scrum framework called Using the Scrum Framework. And this is a nice learning path that starts with the simple mechanics of the Scrum framework that we talk about in the Scrum Guide, but then starts to dive deeper into some of the ways I've talked about today about how Scrum Masters can become more effective in their role, work more effectively with their team, as well as what the career path for a Scrum Master looks like. It also looks at the Scrum framework from the perspective of both the Scrum Master and the product owner, which can be very helpful to you as a Scrum Master, because you can start to get insight into what the product owner is looking for, where the product owner needs help from the Scrum Master. And for better or for worse, certifications are almost a requirement to becoming a Scrum Master, to getting your first position as a Scrum Master, unless you simply grow into the role internally. So look at a couple of certifications. The good news is there are multiple certification bodies, and where they differ the most is how they handle the actual accreditation, how they handle awarding the Scrum Master accreditation. So look at the certification options that are out there and just find the one that makes the most sense for you. And then once you get there, we talk about how you can get better. How you can improve your craft as a Scrum Master? Well, the best thing to do is just to simply seek out learning opportunities. The good news is that because the Scrum Master role has seen such a surge in demand over the past few years, we're also in almost a golden age of Scrum Master resources. There have been great books come out. There have been great videos come out. There are great user groups on LinkedIn for Scrum Masters. They're all incredibly valuable. Go to Amazon, simply look for Scrum Master books, and anything in the top 5 or 6 is definitely a great next step from the resources we just talked about today. There's plenty to draw from. But you'll learn so much more simply from interacting with other Scrum Masters. So find other Scrum Masters in your organization. If there are other Scrum Masters in your organization, choose a morning once a month when everyone can get together, or an afternoon, maybe the second Friday of every month, when all the Scrum Masters can get together and just talk about what their team is doing, what the challenges that they're facing, and how they're addressing them. And you'll be amazed what you learn simply from understanding how different Scrum Masters are addressing and facing similar problems. If there aren't other Scrum Masters in your organization, or maybe you work in a very small company where you're the only Scrum Master there, look locally. Most decent-sized cities anymore have an Agile meetup group or some sort of an Agile user group. That's a great place to start. Go find a few Scrum Masters there, or find a few Scrum Masters that are there, and choose a morning once a month when everyone can get together for coffee before they show up into the office, or find a one day a month everyone can meet for lunch and have these same types of conversations. This can be incredibly informative as well, because you'll start to understand the different perspectives that different Scrum Masters are bringing, simply because they They may be trying different practices. They may have different challenges in their organization that you may not have thought about, and it can really stir a lot of ideas. It can be a great stimulus for how you can work with your team. And definitely one of the most impactful things a Scrum Master can do to grow in their career is to find a mentor. Find someone that you can work one-on-one with in a safe and trusting setting that can really help guide you on how you can progress in your career. Maybe this is someone that's been down the path and they can light the way a little bit for you on your journey, or start to spot the pitfalls that might be lying that you haven't noticed yet. Or maybe this is someone who can simply act as a sounding board and can ask the right questions to help you work through some of the toughest challenges with your team. Whoever it is, having a mentor can be an incredibly impactful step in your career as a Scrum Master. Now, if you're in an organization with a lot of Scrum Masters, senior Scrum Masters or more senior Scrum Masters can be a great place to start. Or if there's a coach on staff in your organization, they're often more than happy to serve this mentorship role because, frankly, it can be very illuminating for them as well. If you don't have access to other Scrum Masters, maybe you've taken a Scrum Master certification class, reach out to your trainer. A lot of Scrum trainers are very happy to continue the relationship after the class in this capacity with you. Or reach out virtually. I mentioned at the beginning of the call, I spend a lot of time mentoring other Scrum Masters virtually through Pluralsight's mentoring offering. There are other coaches and other Scrum Masters that serve a similar role. So you can always find someone who can serve this mentorship role if you're willing to look a little bit. So that's what I have today, and that's mostly what I want to talk about. Now, I really appreciate everyone taking the time to join us today, and once again, taking the time to stay with us today. I also really appreciate everyone staying so engaged throughout the thing. I see a lot of great questions that have really popped up in the Q&A poll. I definitely want to take some time to get to that. Before I do, though, I just want to point you to, here's my contact information. If I do not get to your question today, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. Follow up with me directly. Follow me on anything that I've said today or anything else that sparked an interest. Don't hesitate to reach out to me on Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm very, very responsive on social. If your question is more than 144 characters, don't hesitate to send me an email. You can go to my website, www.jeremyjarrell.com. There is a contact link right in the top middle of the page. Don't hesitate to shoot me an email straight from the contact link with your question. I will be very, very happy to give it my best shot and talk through it with you. So with that said, Lindsay, do we have any questions we want to tackle today?
Yes, so we have a lot of excellent questions coming in. Everyone, please continue to submit them. I did want to make a quick note that, yes, we are recording. For those of you who joined us late, everyone who registered for the webinar will get an email in about a week once the recording is available on our website. So, Jeremy, I have a question here regarding single Scrum Masters working with multiple teams. If you're a single Scrum Master working with multiple teams, how many teams should I expect my Scrum Master to be able to handle?
That's a great question. That's one that comes up a lot. So the simple answer is it depends. It really depends on the maturity of your teams, frankly, and how dependent they are on the Scrum Master on the Scrum Master role, where they are kind of in their agile adoption life cycle, so how much they can really be self-sufficient. It also depends a lot on the experience of a Scrum Master. Now, in general, if I had to kind of put a rule of thumb together or a ballpark together, I would say that for a relatively experienced Scrum Master, I hate to quote years of experience, but someone who maybe has been in the role for about 3 years or so, 2 or 3 years, I would generally expect them for the right team that they could probably handle about 2 or 3 teams. 2 or 3 teams in parallel. Now, I would say I would be very wary of someone who's brand new to the role of embedding them with more than one team, because that Scrum Master is going to need time to really kind of understand the role for themselves and how they can work in the role. So someone who's brand new, I would really start by embedding them only with a single team. But a pretty experienced Scrum Master who's pretty confident in the role and has a good depth of experience to draw from, I would say they could probably do, at least in my experience, they can typically carry between 2 to 3 teams. But the difference between 2 and 3 depending on the maturity of the teams. So if the teams are all pretty mature, or at least 2 of the teams are pretty mature, that they're relatively self-sufficient, a decent Scrum Master, or a relatively experienced Scrum Masters, I should say, could probably carry about 3 teams, because 2 of those teams are going to be much more self-sufficient. They're going to depend on the Scrum Master much less, which is going to free that Scrum Master up to focus more on that third team who may just be getting started and getting their legs underneath them. On the other hand, if the entire organization is new to Scrum and all the Scrum teams are just getting started, all the Scrum teams have a learning curve they have to get through, I would be wary of embedding a Scrum Master with more than 2 teams, at least to start, because there's going to be a lot of heavy lifting at the beginning of that adoption that's going to take a lot of the Scrum Master's time. In any case, I've never seen a Scrum Master be effective with any more than 3 teams. I've seen it tried with more, 4 teams, I think even sometimes more, but in general, 3 seems to be the upper limit there from what I've seen. But like I said, it really depends on your organization. It depends on your Scrum Master, but 2 to 3 is a good ballpark to start with for a pretty experienced Scrum Master.
Okay, great. So this question has come in multiple forms, so I'm going to paraphrase for you. A lot of people are asking what the difference is between a project manager and a Scrum Master.
That is, that's a great question. That one is tough because it really depends on the project manager, and I think actually, let me back that up a little bit. It depends on the behavior of the individual. So the way that we generally address that is that we often paint a picture of the Scrum Master as much more focused on kind of enabling the effectiveness of the team, and we talk about the Scrum Master keeps the team on track and tries to work with the team to deliver value, but they're really working on making sure, is the team working in a sustainable fashion? Are they working at a good pace? Is the team happy? Does the team want to come into work every day so they're going to be doing good work, or is everyone miserable? They're really looking more at the dynamics of the team and understanding what they need to do, how they need to be working behind the scenes to make the team happier, healthier, and more effective. Project managers, we often paint this picture of, the project manager is much more focused on the end delivery of the team. Is the team on task? Is the team really doing everything that that they need to do to be effective or to be successful? And that's where we're starting. Now, in actuality, the difference is often much muddier, because there are a lot of project managers I've had the pleasure of working with that are really genuinely concerned about the team, and they really start with the team first, and they're very happy there. And frankly, I've worked with some Scrum Masters who really aren't that concerned about the team. So the difference isn't quite as black and white as we often like to paint it in the Agile space. So while that is something to think about, something to start with, where I often see the biggest difference arise is that we talk a lot in Agile in general, but specifically about Scrum, about self-organizing teams, self-directed teams. And what this really means is that the product owner, and maybe with the assistance of the Scrum Master, is essentially bringing the work to the development team. And the development team is then figuring out how they can best handle this. What is the size of this work? How complex does this look? What's the best way for them to break it up? And who needs to be taking each way? How do they need to approach it? The development team, as a virtue of being self-organizing, self-directing, are really responsible for building the plan of how they're going to most effectively deliver that work. In a traditional project management setting, we see a lot more of that burden go to the project manager, because the project manager takes much more of responsibility, maybe even for sizing the work up front, but especially you often see a more traditional project manager chunking out the work, breaking the work down, and assigning it to the individuals on the team and saying, Jim, I'd like for you to work on this item. Susan, I want you to work on this item. When you're done, whoever finishes this moves on to this. So it's much more hands-on. It's much more directive of the work. So that's usually the best way to think about it, is that you see the Scrum Master kind of enable much more of a self-management, a self-direction of the team, where the project owner, the project manager, tends to be much more hands-on, especially at the sizing and especially at the assignment and task allocation stage of the game.
Great. Okay, so a few more minutes for questions. This is an interesting one. What is your opinion on being a Scrum Master of a remote team?
Yeah, that's a really good one, and that's something that's becoming more and more common. So I'm not going to stand here and say it can't work. I'm I'm sure there are success stories. I'm sure, and I actually, I think I'm going to say sure. I've had the pleasure of interacting with Scrum Masters who seem like they've been very successful in a remote role as a Scrum team. I will say as a cautionary note, it can be incredibly challenging. And the reason is that because we talked a lot about where the Scrum Master needs to be very versed in emotional intelligence. They need to be able to build high levels of empathy with their team. They need to build strong relationships. That's more difficult to do when you're not face to face with a team. When you're because you miss a lot in not being able to see body language clearly, even if you're over a webcam, not being able to see body language as clearly, not able to see exact real-time feedback. There's a lot that we pick up on intuitively from being in a room with someone that you honestly don't miss until you try to have similar conversations over the phone or over the webcam. So there absolutely are challenges to it, but I think it can be done. I think the biggest thing that I would ask for someone who is considering becoming a Scrum Master for a remote team is the entire team distributed, so everyone essentially is remote, or is this a situation where maybe all the developers are co-located in one geographic area and the Scrum Master is in another geographic area and the product owner is in another geographic area? So when the development team maybe is all co-located and the Scrum Master is isolated from that, that's going to be a huge hill to climb for the Scrum Master to build those relationships, not just with the development team, but with the product owner as well, versus if everyone is distributed and frankly everyone is having their conversations every day over webcams, over the phone, everyone's on a little bit more of an even playing field. It's still going to be challenging, but I think it's much more attainable than if the entire team was co-located minus the Scrum Master.
Okay, so we have a couple questions that are coming in regards to which certifications make the most sense or what certification options are available. I'll let you kind of address that question in a generic manner.
Okay. So absolutely, there are definitely plenty of certification options available for Scrum Master. There have actually been a few more that have popped up that popped up just in the past few years. Actually, I think they've been largely driven by demand. So some of the names that you might see pop up is Scrum Alliance, Scrum.org, PMI, ACP, IC Agile. These are all certification bodies that are becoming more common. In general, the two that you're most likely to encounter, especially in the Western world, in the U.S. and Europe in particular, the two you're most likely to encounter or to see requested, I should say, whenever you're job hunting as a Scrum Master, are Scrum Alliance's Certified Scrum Master certification, what we often call the CSM, and Scrum.org's Professional Scrum Master certification, what we call the PSM. So, like I say, in general, but both certifications are very common. They both tend to be treated with pretty even respect. Often when I work with Scrum Masters who are job hunting right now, what I'll see is if they have a job requisition they're looking at, it will either say CSM or PSM, or it'll say CSM or equivalent or PSM or equivalent. I've never heard of a case where someone, for example, may have a PSM and the requisition is asking for a CSM and the hiring manager said, no, I need a CSM. In general, people treat the certifications equivalent. They're happy if you have one or the other. Both are based off of the Scrum Guide. Both are earned by taking a test that tests your knowledge of the Scrum mechanics. Both have they have advanced tiers of certifications as well. Scrum Alliance's advanced Scrum Master certification tier is very, very new, even within just the past few weeks. So we're still kind of waiting to see how that pans out, but Scrum.org has a 3-tier PSM ladder as well. So they're both pretty equivalent across the board on a lot of things. Where those two certifications really differ is what the accreditation path looks like in order to earn that accreditation. The big difference is that so while for both certifications you have to pass an online test before you can earn it, in the case of Scrum Alliance offers a 2-day training course, 2-day live training course. You must attend an in-person 2-day training course taught by a certified Scrum trainer before you're eligible to take the CSM test. So you have to attend the class first in person. Scrum.org makes 2-day classes available. They're 2-day in-person classes, but they're not required as a prerequisite for taking the exam. They can be helpful, and there are deals essentially where you attend the class, you'll earn a discount on the exam. I can use how it works, but there's a pretty significant discount on your first attempt at the exam, so it's there to enable it, but it's not required. If you have experience as a Scrum Master, if you're pretty confident in the mechanics of the Scrum framework, you can actually say, you know what, I think I have the gist of this. I'm going to go out. I'm just going to take the professional Scrum Master exam online and to give it one try without taking the test. I personally, I've gotten feedback from a lot of people just in the past few months alone who have said that in all cases, these are people who have experience as Scrum Masters, but they said the combination of essentially going back and studying the Scrum Guide, watching the Scrum Framework Learning Path on Pluralsight, and then taking the practice tests, which are available for free on Scrum.org site, has been enough to prepare them for the PSM Level 1 exam. So that's definitely an option. That's, like I said, but you can also take the test, take the class. I've taken Scrum.org classes. I will be the first to say they're great classes. They're especially as a Scrum Master, especially as you're more experienced, you encounter a lot of scenarios that are covered in Scrum.org. They talk a lot about how about how you can overcome a lot of challenges you're really likely to face as a Scrum Master inside your organization. So the classes are incredibly valuable, and I definitely would recommend them to people. But they're absolutely optional to take any of the Scrum.org exams. So that's the biggest difference you'll see, is if the classes are required or if the classes are optional.
Okay, and with that, we are just over time, so I am going to wrap up by thanking you, Jeremy, for sharing your expertise with us and taking the time to address these questions. Once again, the information on Jeremy's slide is available so that you can reach out and contact him with any questions that didn't get answered. This presentation was recorded. We are going to share it with everyone who registered. Give us a couple of days to put this on our website, and we'll let you know when it's available. And Jeremy, thank you again. And everyone, please have an excellent rest of your day.
Lindsay, thank you very much, and everyone also, I want to echo that. Thank you so much for joining us today and for hearing what we have to say. I really appreciate everyone taking time out of their day today.